Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Finance and Investment session of the Climate Adaptation Summit 2021. My name is Lauren Razavi, and I will be your moderator for this session. It's my pleasure to introduce your hosts, Emma Howard-Boyd and Andrew Steer. Emma is the chair of the UK Environment Agency and UK Commissioner to the Global Commission on Adaptation. She joins us live from Bristol today. Andrew is the CEO and President of the World Resources Institute and a Commissioner and Managing Partner for the Global Commission on Adaptation. He joins us live from Washington, DC. Without further ado, I'll hand over to them to kick off the session.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to you all for joining the Finance and Investment anchoring event of the Climate Adaptation Summit. It's a huge honour to be co-hosting this event with fellow Commissioner Andrew Steer. Last week, communities in England narrowly avoided widespread damage from Storm Christophe. It was a stark reminder that the economic benefits of being well prepared far outweigh the financial consequences of damage. At the Environment Agency, we know for every £1 used to improve protection from flooding and coastal erosion, we avoid around £5 of property damages. Around the world, the Global Commission on Adaptation found that the benefits of adapting are on average around 4 times greater than the costs. In the last year, the coronavirus crisis has underlined vulnerabilities in our financial and economic system. As David Attenborough's Perfect Planet programme has explained, the shift in global temperatures risks multiple climate impacts that will be even harder to predict. Yet we have a huge financing gap on the ground where action is most needed. Current flows of finance amount to $30 billion US, but the UN estimates that developing country needs alone could reach $300 billion US a year by the end of the decade. Ahead of COP26 this year, the UN has launched a race to net zero and a race to resilience, but we will only win these races if we are backed by the trillions of finance. With Joe Biden recommitting the US to the Paris Agreement, now is the time for finance to join a truly global effort to reduce emissions and prepare for impacts. The key challenges are, first, understanding the financial implication of climate shocks. Second, knowing the full benefits of early action. And third, knowing where best to put our money to manage risks and capture the opportunities. During the opening ceremony earlier today, we've already heard some ambitious finance-related commitments from leaders around the world, and we'll come back to those throughout this event. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Emma, and let me add my warm word of welcome to all of you to this important event. It's been an honor for us at the World Resources Institute to have been managing partner of the Global Commission on Adaptation over the last 2 years, together with the Global Center on Adaptation. We've now made a case that is irrefutable, that adapting, as Emma says, is not only great for the environment, it's not only great for people, it's great for the economy too. We used to think that adaptation was something you had to do to stop something bad happening in the future. We now know that actually smart adaptation opens up all kinds of possibilities for things today as well. And as the world is about to spend between 10 and $20 trillion to reboot the world economy, we now also know that spending on adaptation actually is a quick and effective way of creating jobs. There's a lot of analysis on that. So the question is, why are we not doing it? And there are many reasons for that. One is that finance is simply not flowing. And that's what we want to focus on today, both on the private side and on the public side. And how can we shift the entire financial system, if you like? As Emma says, it was very encouraging today to hear Secretary General Guterres say, look, by the end of this year, everybody needs to commit to spend at least half of climate finance on adaptation. Kristalina Georgieva, head of the IMF, said, we're going to change the way we do our surveillance of countries. Our Article 4 is going to take climate risk into account. John Kerry, the new special envoy, He said, not only is the United States going to issue an ambitious NDC, we're also going to play our role financially. President Macron said, we're going to put in an extra $2 billion into adaptation. The African Development Bank said $25 billion of which into climate finance overall, of which half will be for adaptation. And the World Bank, we've got Marie Pangestu here, the managing director. We're going to hear from her in a minute. The World Bank has committed also to make half of all they do for adaptation. So we're making some progress, but still, as Emma says, nowhere near enough. Now, just to set the scene, we're now going to see a brief video, and then I'm going to introduce our first panel. So let's roll it.
The climate crisis is accelerating, threatening economies, lives, and ecosystems. Communities are facing more frequent and severe storms, unpredictable rainfall, and increasing temperatures.
We must redouble our efforts to improve the conditions for the most vulnerable in our societies so that they are empowered and supported to manage disasters and climate risks.
Despite clear calls for action, investments in adaptation and resilience lag far behind needs.
Despite the pandemic, the impacts of climate change continue to be clear and increasing. While fires are burning in California, intense flooding has damaged homes and destroyed livelihoods in Sudan, India, Yemen, Bangladesh, and many more other locations. Climate change adaptation is as important as it has ever been. The urgency and ambition needed to fully prepare for the future must continue to increase if we are to protect ourselves and our communities.
Many communities are already integrating adaptation and resilience into their activities, as are countries and international organizations. But more is needed.
Currently, only 20% of climate finance goes to adaptation projects. To increase finance for adaptation, public development banks, which represent 10% of global investments worldwide, can play a decisive role. These public banks can also better leverage private investments for a climate-resilient recovery from COVID-19.
The capacity to formulate climate science, climate policy, climate investment, the capacity to financial engineer all types of instruments, public, private, domestic, national, and as well as the capacity to execute.
The international community needs to deliver on the $100 billion goal in climate finance. This is a precondition to develop the capacity and transform the market needed to align financial flows to reduce emission and adapt to climate change. We need to leverage the new generation of NDCs to foster synergies between adaptation, mitigation, development finance, as well as COVID-19 economic stimulus measures. Integrated policies that capture triple wins for health, growth, and climate could reduce by 40% the required total investment to achieve the SDGs and the Paris Agreement.
We have to transform the way we work. We have to transform the way we make development reach everybody. And we have to transform the way in which we make communities of vulnerable groups across different types of urban and rural areas into partners in development, producing resilience and transformative action that not only changes the quality of their lives, our lives, and the health of the planet.
We need governments to step up and make adaptation a priority in 2021 and beyond.
Well, that was great. So we have a lot of work to do. We need to get the financial sector to become a friend and a driver of adaptation. And the financial sector has not always been, quite frankly. The financial sector tends to look short-term, and it tends to be very conservative. So it tends to do things that it's done before, and it hasn't done enough of adaptation. But it's now changing, And we have three leaders here today, the A team, that are on the front line thinking about these issues every single day. First, we've got Dr. Marie Pangestu, who is Managing Director of the World Bank, overseeing all of the policy on these issues at the World Bank Group. She was, before that, Minister of Trade in Indonesia. She was Minister of Tourism and the Innovative Economy, and is one of the best-known economists in Southeast Asia. So welcome, Marie, from Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to have Ibrahima Diong, who is the Director General of the Africa Risk Capacity Institution, and also an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Before that, he was also a minister. All three of these, by the way, have been ministers. He was a key minister in the President's office in Senegal. Ibrahima, fantastic to have you here, working on so many interesting issues relating to this. And then Felipe Lorraine, who was Minister of Finance of Brazil, which is hard to think of a more relevant job in this. And he was one of the founders of the Global Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Change. And so we're going to sort of ask him. He's also a leading professor of economics. I want to start with Marie Pangestu. Marie, financing adaptation is not that easy, but the World Bank has certainly made big commitments and you seem to be on track. What are you learning about financing adaptation?
I think we're learning a lot. Adaptation is much harder to do, as we have found from the lessons that we have been learning. But I think we have come a long way also in making sure that all our projects have climate action, both on the mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience side. But I think the biggest challenge is actually getting countries on board to integrate it into their national planning. And, you know, as a former minister, I think that's really the big challenge for us. You mentioned, and then I think the preceding video and all that talked about how achieving action on climate can lead to growth, jobs, addressing vulnerability, and so on. And this is really, I think, the challenge for us at the bank to provide the information, the data, the knowledge, and the tools for countries to be able to come up with these kinds of answers. And because, you know, you said that financing and so on are beginning to think in that way, but they're short-term. Politicians and policymakers also have a very short-term cycle. Whereas, you know, we know the benefits are longer term. So how do we make a convincing argument that this is not a trade-off? Addressing climate adaptation, climate action is going to help your growth, your development, create jobs, better quality human capital, which will lead to increased productivity and so on, and also address the vulnerable populations. You know, take a country like Indonesia. Well, we are not a vulnerable country, we don't come under FCV, but areas of Indonesia which have been disaster prone are FCV, if you like, within a country. So I think this is really the big challenge. And financing is one side of it, but financing will only will happen and will go to the areas where it needs to go if we can come up with a very credible plan as to where it should go and where it would have the most impact. And this is what we are working on very closely, both at the national level and the local level, local government, very, very important, and at the community level.
Thank you very much, Marie. If anybody wants to learn more, go to the World Bank's website on adaptation, doing some fascinating work along the lines that that Marie was talking about. Let's go to Ibrahima Diong. Ibrahima, you obviously run the risk capacity, the Africa Risk Capacity Group, and you're working with African countries to help them prepare for and deal with disasters, and working with the insurance industry. Tell us what you're learning.
Well, let me pick up where Marie is at the left on, just to make a very general point. And that is that adaptation has to go side by side with resilience. And I think the case of Africa is extremely relevant. I was pleased to hear in the video they couple the two, and that is adaptation and resilience, as opposed to one without the other. Now, having said that, if you look at the African context, what basically we're learning is the African themselves, to the African Union, have decided to have to work on the latter, and that is the resilience part, which goes hand in hand with adaptation, by asking three fundamental questions, to which we'll bring some answers to. One is that do the African countries themselves have a good visibility on their risk exposure when it comes to climate change, so they can take the necessary step within their budget, so the structure, but also using other means to mobilize resources as well. And I think the second question that we're asking ourselves, to what extent actually our countries are prepared to respond to disasters when it occurs in a coordinated manner, so that because when disaster occurs, every second count in saving the lives of Africans across the continent. And then the last point, obviously, it's that what kind of response can we provide, particularly with regard to financing, so that we don't wait till the disaster occurs to looking for financing, particularly in the different world we live in. Now, what are some of the lessons learned from the process after 8 years of operation, protecting about 72 million Africans across the continent and covering about over $700 million of coverage across the continent? There are a couple of things that emerge, which is extremely relevant to this conversation. Number one is premium financing. I mean, Andrew, you made it that point in the beginning with COVID-19. It's even harder today to mobilize resources to premium financing. But the good news is that the African institution, starting with the African Development Bank, together with us, has put together a platform called the Disaster Financing kind of platform, which provides subsidies to African governments so they can actually afford the premium financing. But just think about it, what we could do if we got more resources to pay for the subsidies across the continent. And BMZ and KfW, other donors, are also providing support to address the premium financing questions. I have to admit that I was extremely pleased this morning when I heard the Secretary General of the UN asking for scaling up initiatives like ours, because if you do so, we can actually protect over millions of Africans across the board. I think number two lessons that are emerging, Maria mentioned that earlier, and that is that in Africa, we need to make sure that our countries have a disaster financing strategies across the board. So we don't actually address the issues on a piecemeal basis, but rather in a much more strategic way across our countries. And last but not least, it is absolutely important that in our countries across the board, we build the capacities of African countries so that they can have policy dealing with disasters. But more importantly, they also have a sense of kind of awareness that you don't wait till the disaster occurs to begin to take the necessary step as well. And the final point I have to make, Andrew, is the following. If you look at disaster across Africa, it's not only one disaster kind of fits all. While drought is very present in the Sahel, we talk about tropical cyclone or maybe flooding in other parts of Africa. So we need to be able to support African across the board, depending on the type of disaster they're dealing with, so that we are able to actually respond to the demand of the African countries as well. At the end of the day, our ambition is to make sure through disaster financing to protect as many Africans as possible in the billion, so that climate change does not affect the life of vulnerable people going forward. Over to you, Andrew.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ibrahima. And I'd like to come back in a minute and ask you a little more about the whole idea of insurance, because obviously in what you're doing, you need public money. But in addition to that, you want to learn from and exploit and use the expertise in the insurance sector and so on. So love to hear about that. Felipe, when I introduced you before, I got carried away and I said you were from Brazil, but actually you're from Chile, which I knew very well, of course. So I apologize. It was Chile actually that led the way to sort of start the coalition of finance ministers. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like for a finance minister. I mean, we've spent most of the last 100 years doing our planning on the assumption that, it's straight lines and smooth curves. And actually, the future now is looking very different, isn't it? And I think you were one of the finance ministers that said, wait a minute, we need to plan differently. We need to think about risk management and so on. Could you speak as a finance minister now and tell us what you would like the finance ministers around the world to be doing more of?
Thank you very much, Andrew. First of all, I would like to express it's a privilege and an honor to be part of this panel. I'm glad you corrected that I'm not from Brazil. I got a few calls from friends in Brazil saying, "Hey, you were never our finance minister." So, and on the issue of the coalition of finance ministers, I would first like to say that why did we form? I was a founding member and I had the honor of leading the coalition, at the start of its period. And why is it important that finance ministers get involved in climate change? It's not directly a part of the things that we normally do. But first, I think the issue of climate change is so important that we thought that we didn't need, and it was not fair to just leave it to environmental ministers. So, finance ministers needed to be part and take action on the challenges posed by climate change. And we have seen the impacts of climate shocks on economic growth, on the public budgets, and private investment flows in vulnerable areas. So to combat these impacts, we need to integrate climate risks across all financial decision-making in setting, and here are one of the very basic parts, in setting the public budgets, in the regulation of the private sector, in fiscal policy, in tax policy. Carbon taxing, for example, is one major area which is on the realm of finance ministers, but on the other hand, it's an area where it's part of the environmental and it's part of the climate tools. Subsidies on fossil fuels are another area of finance where finance ministers need to take action. At the same time, that is a very important part of a policy that damages the environment. So I would say those are the kind of things, carbon taxes, fossil fuel subsidies, other types of taxation, the private sector, incorporating the private sector. And I would say the coalition of finance ministers has made great progress in this space to establish best practices to help countries understand and manage financial risks and mobilize the private sector. Most importantly, it is helping to generate and demonstrate that there is a political will to become involved across the spectrum, across the executive power. It's not just only environmental ministers that are concerned about this, it's also the finance ministers, the whole government, as many leaders put it today but I would say there is still a long way to go. We will need to do a lot more to develop best practice tools and methodologies to help countries understand what works and what does not work. And let me also say something on an issue that Ibrahim just mentioned, which is the following. I would, in terms of disaster finance and disaster tools, finance tools for disasters, I would mention catastrophe bonds. And I had the opportunity to be part of the first catastrophe bond in the Americas, or at least in Latin America, when at the Pacific Alliance, 4 countries got together, pooled the risks, and developed and issued this first catastrophe bond. The countries were Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And we are facing, as Ibrahim mentioned, also for Africa, we are facing different types of natural disasters. In our country, we have more earthquakes. We may have a tsunami. In other countries, we have floodings, we have droughts, we have several different things. And by pooling the risks together, we can get better terms. So financially, I think it was a very good policy, a very good idea, a very good tool to have this catastrophe bond. So let me stop here and just react a bit to your question and to what was said previously in the panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Felipe. That was terrific. Marie, could we come back to you? Obviously, the World Bank is thinking a lot about the kind of stimulus to make sure the developing and emerging world sort of comes back. You're having a lot of creative thoughts. And obviously, you're putting resources into the developing world, and there's thought about maybe a supplemental IDA coming along, sort of thing. Hope to hear, and so you've made a commitment that 50% will be for adaptation of your climate finance. But of course, I mean, you can only lend money that people want to borrow. So, and as someone that worked for the World Bank, you know, I know that it's a two-way dialogue. I would love to hear from you, sort of the demand side of this, the sort of where the supply, you supply the funding, but the demand side is countries borrow resources from you. Is it now, are you seeing that developing countries are saying, yes, please, this is obviously a priority, or is there an interesting dialogue? And where's the interaction standing on that now, particularly as we're going through this period, hopefully, of real stimulus?
Yeah, you know, obviously what we are doing right now is what we call front loading our resources for IDA. And then by 2022, we're going to see increased need for more resources. And this is something that we are discussing, obviously, with our shareholders. But more importantly, how do we prioritize what we are doing now in the short term, in the recovery period, that also has an eye on, you know, longer term adaptation or resilience outcomes, which will have positive outcomes for the countries that we work in, whether it's IDA or IBRD. And obviously, we are working in all kinds of situations, countries which are vulnerable, countries which are subject to also conflict and natural disasters, like what we are doing in Bangladesh with the floods, and with Mozambique, and with Somalia, which has been hit with natural disaster as well as conflict and so on. So I think there is a demand, but how to craft the demand so that you can actually come up with programs that address their immediate needs, but also has an eye on the longer term resilience and adaptation. So just to give you a few of the kind of examples that we are working with countries, I think social protection programs, we are adapting these social protection programs very much with vulnerability in climate prone areas, so that you adapt the social, well, you need the social protection, but you adapt it to the needs of particularly vulnerable groups and also in disaster prone areas. So you adapt the social protection program as you are rolling it out for the emergency need, but you are also building in the resilience need. And I think the other one that's very interesting is what we call community-based programs that work on creating jobs and stimulus, but at the same time are addressing an adaptation or a need for resilience. Restoration of landscapes or seascapes. We have a number of programs. Indonesia is about to also hopefully roll out a program on restoration of mangroves and coral reefs, for instance, which will create jobs in the short term, but will improve the livelihood of the fishermen, of the farmers, and of tourism in the future. And this also has been, we have also been working with Fiji on this and a lot of the small island states, because it's, in a way, if you're looking at where's the opportunity in the crisis, you want to be creating jobs and stimulus programs which are very community-based, which will help them be more resilient in the future and also improve their livelihoods and productivity in the future. And I see a lot of opportunities there, but it does need the knowledge, the analytics, and the tools to be able to come up with the programs that would hopefully not just be financed by the World Bank, but could also bring in other co-financiers, private sector, and so on, including issuance of blue bonds or green bonds that will then build on this platform. And finally, the thing that we are really, ideally what we are working hard with countries on, with, I guess, maybe about 34 countries now in our program, as I was mentioning earlier. How do you integrate climate action that is both mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in the country's national programs? And this takes the whole government approach, the whole economy approach, including the local government. And this is the key to me for financing, because it will require you not to it's not just about budget allocation, that's part of it, but it's about reforms, right? It's the opportunity to come up with reforms that will then lead to the incentives for financing, including the coming up with the innovative instruments, whether it's carbon pricing, carbon taxes, and including also your financial sector. How do you have the green principles? How do you have the green standards? So it's a whole package of reforms, which I think will be more difficult to implement in the short term. But if you can at least get a buy-in at the beginning and find opportunities, including where we are working on reducing fuel subsidy or agriculture fertilizer subsidy and repurpose it for in sustainable infrastructure or adaptation or resilience. You know, this is the signal that I think finance will need to flow. You know, I just want to emphasize that, because before I joined the bank, I was working with many parts of the world and in Indonesia, and we found that financing is an issue, but more of an issue is the actual policy environment and the certainty, because these are long-term investments to drive that finance too. And it does need a whole of government and whole of society approach. All the stakeholders have to be on the same page.
That's extremely helpful, Marie. Thank you. I mean, you made the point that we need the right kind of diagnostic tools, which we haven't always had in the past. We need the right kind of innovation in financial instruments. And above all, we need an environment in which money will flow in and be effective. And that requires sort of policy and a change in mindset. So that's extremely helpful. Ibrahima, could I ask you about, Marie was talking about if you get the policy right, surely the money will come. I would imagine, I mean, you think you run something that's called the African Risk Capacity Group, helping African countries prepare for disasters, manage for disasters. I'm assuming that funding is just very plentiful for you right now, but maybe it's not. So I'd like you to be honest. Speaking as an African, do you feel that the international community is supporting you enough? And also, while you're about it, if you could say a word also about what we're learning now on the whole issue of catastrophic or disaster risk management, insurance, the kind of thing Felipe was talking about. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so you have to do it in less than 2 minutes. Go.
I'll do it in 1 minute, Andrew. That will make your life easier. Let me just, before I get to your point, let me make a point that Maria brought up, which is extremely important in this conversation. If you look at the risk profile of the African countries, the solution from a financial point of view, it's not just about what we do. If you look at the risk layering, there are opportunities that have been provided for institutions like ourselves, but also for the World Bank and others to come together. So I think if we focus on the demand and the needs of the African countries, we must come together and provide solutions, some coming from us, some coming from an institution like the World Bank, because the solutions are not always of insurance nature. They also have a financing option. We talked about leveraging the capital market to get the green bond, the Catastrophe Bond, and all that. So therefore, it's really important that mindset has to switch and focus on the needs of the African countries sort of going forward. I think what we're learning, and just going back to your questions, is that we should not approach disaster management in Africa only from a financing point of view. It has to be holistic for two reasons. Number one, we have to make sure that the African countries themselves, from a policy point of view, and make sure they actually embed disaster management into their national policies in the way it shows this is something they actually take seriously, but more importantly, this is something they actually plan ahead in a much more sustainable manner. And I'm very pleased to hear in many of our member states, they're taking this very seriously and will continue to advocate so that disaster risk management becomes really the daily routine and policy in the countries as well. But I think what we're also learning, and I talked about earlier, and that is money is one thing, but the capacity of the countries to actually handle disasters is equally important. And that's the reason why we believe in our intervention to also focus on capacity building in the form that the countries themselves will not depend on us endlessly, so that at some point they begin in a much more sustainable manner to be able to take care of disaster in their own countries as well. I think also what we're learning, and we're not talking about this, Andrew, and that is the impact of disaster on vulnerable communities. We need to tell the stories of people actually who are being protected because of what we do.
That's terrific. Thank you, Ibrahima, very much. Okay, I'm going to turn for a 1-minute response from Felipe to a question, and then I'm going to come to each of the three of you and ask you to end the session completing a sentence. And the sentence is on adaptation finance. By the end of 2021, I hope that, what are you hoping? Or we must, maybe if you make it an imperative, not a hope. In other words, what's the one thing you really feel we need to do and we can do this year? But 1 minute from you first, Felipe. So do you sort of, how goes the battle overall with regard to those that make big financial decisions? And they tend to be ministers of budget, ministers of finance, ministers of economics. Do you feel that the journey is sort of accelerating? How would you characterize where we are now? You're muted.
Okay. Do you hear me now? Yes? You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that we are making progress. We are making progress in the sense that we are forming this coalition of finance ministers. There's another coalition of central bank governors for climate action. There is this V20 vulnerable group of finance ministers, which the so-called Climate Vulnerable Forum. I think we should be talking more among ourselves, and these different groups are not already, they're in the process of, trying to survive, trying to make progress in terms of what they can deliver. But I think we should be talking more among ourselves. I think the climate risk being part of mainstream finance, to be incorporated in mainstream finance, I think we're making progress over there. And we are seeing a bigger participation of green finance, for example, the spectacular growth of green bonds. Countries, and different institutions have lost their fear, to issuing green bonds. And, not only because it's a good thing to do, it's a responsible way to act towards our environmental challenges, but because there is a green premium. I happen to be in the ministry when we issued in Chile the first green bond in the Americas, the first sovereign green bond, and we got a 5 basis point premium over a regular bond. And because now there is increased demand from the private sector for this kind of instruments. Many of the investors, are looking to allocate a piece of their funds they manage to this kind of green environmental, investments. So I think that we are making progress. Much more should be done, but I think we are in the process of advancing all these goals, which are very dear to our hearts and which are so important for the world as a whole.
Wonderful. Thank you, Felipe, very much indeed. So we'll start with Marie. In the coming year, we must,
by the end of 2021, have a shared vision and meaningful commitment by all stakeholders on financing climate adaptation and resilience.
Amen. Well done. All one sentence too. We'll go to you, Felipe. What's your one sentence?
Well, we are concerned we must. At GCA, some of the research at GCA says that in 2020, resources going to adaptation finance have fallen at around 10% after having increased very significantly. So I expect, and I would hope that by the end of 2021, we could reverse this, that we can, not only the World Bank, which is doing it, comply with increasing the resources for adaptation. We just mentioned the $300 billion in adaptation finance needed for 2030. We are at 30 billion now, so we are 1/10. The World Bank is doing a fair share, a split, an even split between mitigation and adaptation. Very few institutions are doing this.
One sentence.
Yes, so I expect more resources and getting closer to the 50-50.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Ibrahima, in 2021, we must
establish a $10 billion premium financing for Africa so we can protect the lives of Africans across the board, over 200 million. If we get the premium financing fund, our organization will be on the forefront and making sure Africans are protected from climate change disasters.
Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. Look at that.
Yes, I do.
It's a deal. You got it. You got it, Ibrahima. So let me hand back now to Lauren. Thank you for this wonderful group of speakers. Thank you for all you're doing. This session, we focused primarily on public finance, you notice. We're now going to go back to Emma and have a very good discussion on private finance and financial systems. So thank you very much, Marie Pangestu, Ibrahima Dion.
Thank you.
Lauren. Thank you. Back to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Andrew, and to all of the panelists who spoke there. We've highlighted the significant work that's ahead, and it's crucial we ensure that adaptation and resilience is at the forefront of public decision-making, and that we mobilize the necessary financing. Now we will bid a farewell to Andrew and move from Washington back to the UK. And what better place to discuss our next topic, the global financial system and the transformation needed to facilitate resilient pathways for global growth. We will begin with a video, and then we will move on to another distinguished panel of speakers.
A world of rising risks needs financial tools that can protect the most vulnerable people and economies. Governments and the private sector are working together to address gaps in policy and information and mobilize financing for climate adaptation and resilience.
We need to move beyond the billions and shift the trillions that are needed for a truly resilient recovery from COVID-19. Investors, supervisors, and regulators are increasingly aware of how climate impacts are affecting their portfolios, supply chains, and ultimately their bottom line.
The days are gone that central banks didn't know how to spell the word sustainability. The days are gone that supervisors didn't know what the Sustainable Development Goals were. The days are behind us that the climate crisis was never discussed in the corridors of central banks. Then the financial sector has a vital role to play. By providing loans to their clients, by investing funds that have been entrusted to them, financial firms wield leverage on the real economy. And we, on our turn, we central banks and supervisors, wield leverage over the financial sector. So this double leverage is incredibly powerful. It's an incredible, powerful force that can and must be used to achieve the Paris goals.
We need to develop new valuation methodologies that balance off the higher upfront cost of climate resilient infrastructure with the lower operating cost and lower climate physical and transition risk. Such methodologies will enable financiers to better assess the rate of return of climate resilient investment in a changing climate. We need to create new climate resilient financial products to match the risk profile of products familiar to institutional investors. These could include resilient bonds or green ABS, for example.
The financial sector has a unique responsibility to improve climate resiliency, a responsibility to our clients and the communities we serve. That's because we have the potential to make a huge difference. We can connect investors with green projects around the world. We can devise new products and solutions to major challenges. We can work with governments to raise sustainable investment standards.
Climate adaptation can deliver big economic benefits. For every dollar we invest in reducing risks and adapting, we can see up to 10 times that in net benefits. That's why financing adaptation and a resilient recovery has never been more important.
Projects around the world. We can devise products and solutions to major challenges. We can work with government to raise sustainable investments.
I can still hear the video speaking.
Adaptation can economic benefits. For every dollar we invest in reducing risks and adapting, we can see up to 10 times that in net benefits.
There's still a video playing.
That's why financing adaptation and a resilient recovery has never been more important.
Thank you. Great to see that fantastic video outlining some of the risks and opportunities and why we need climate adaptation finance. We have a fantastic panel with us today, ready to discuss the challenge of transforming the global financial system. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Ma Jun. Dr. Ma is the chair of the China Green Finance Committee and co-chair of the G20 Green Finance Group. In a previous role with the People's Bank of China, he played a leading role in the work of the Network for Greening the Financial System. Dr. Ma, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join this important summit on climate adaptation finance. Let me start with a few words on green finance development in China, and then switch to the topic on how green finance can be more supportive for adaptation projects. Over the past few years, China has established a framework of green finance, which includes what I call 4 pillars. The first pillar is a set of standards that define the boundary of green activities to be supported by green loans, green bonds, and other green finance instruments. The second pillar is a disclosure requirements for project owners or issuers to disclose environmental information and climate information. The third pillar is a suite of products which include green loans, green bonds, green funds, green ABS, green ETF, and the carbon market. And the fourth pillar is policy incentives, which include low-cost funding offered by the central bank through commercial banks to green projects, as well as local government incentives in the form of subsidies and guarantees. As of now, China has developed the world's largest green lending market and the second largest green bond market, measured by outstanding amount of green loans and green bonds. In terms of climate-related projects financed by green finance instruments in China, the majority of those are related to mitigation, which include renewable energies, green transportation, green buildings, and so on. Adaptation projects receive a very small part of the green financing so far. There are several challenges to adaptation finance. Number one, many local governments do not yet have the capacity to assess physical risks related to climate change, and therefore unable to propose and plan the right adaptation projects. Number two, many of these projects, such as irrigation, flood control, wetland, and forestry projects, do not have the cash flow or profitability that can attract private sector money. So they are largely financed with limited fiscal resources or by a few development finance agencies. Number three, many of these adaptation projects require long-term financing, while most private sector financing sources, including those from commercial banks, are unable to participate due to maturity mismatch. To address these challenges, I think we need to collectively work on several solutions. One is to offer capacity building and technical assistance to local governments for assessing physical risks and for planning adaptation projects. Second is to explore PPP mechanisms that allow private sector investors to participate in less profitable adaptation projects and more profitable commercial projects, such as urban real estate projects, simultaneously. The third is for governments and central banks to offer incentives directly to commercial banks for them to participate in adaptation projects. And finally, the exploration of the green bond market for long-term financing to address the maturity mismatch problem. That's all I wanted to say today. Thanks to the Global Commission on Adaptation for the invitation, and I wish the conference a great success.
Thank you, Dr. Ma. The leadership of China in the green finance space is truly exemplary. And you've highlighted some of the solutions we need for adaptation finance. To hear more about how the solutions to these challenges Dr. Ma has laid out, we're now going to turn to our distinguished panel. It's my pleasure to introduce John Haley, the chair of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment and the CEO of Willis Towers Watson, one of the world's largest advisory, broking and solution companies. John, welcome today.
Thank you,
Next, I'd like to introduce Odile Renaud-Basso, the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the first ever woman to head a multilateral development bank. Welcome, Odile. And finally, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Vera Songwe, Under Secretary General at the United Nations and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. So to kick us off, I'm going to turn to Vera. In the first session, we heard about some of the critical climate-related challenges that the African continent faces, compounded by the impacts brought on by the current pandemic. How can we go beyond a conversation about development finance and truly address the systemic challenges of resilient investment on the continent? And what is the Economic Commission for Africa doing in this space?
Thank you, Emma. Hi, John. Odile, good to see you. And Happy New Year to everybody who is listening to us. I think this topic could not come at a more opportune time. The question of financing for us is both a question of financing our recovery from, of course, the health pandemic, but also coming out of it differently, coming out of it better. We all know about the impacts of the COVID crisis, but the climate crisis on the continent cost us about 5% of our GDP annually. For some countries, actually, it is even higher than that. It's 7-8%. I think the benefit of talking about financing now is saying, what are the different ways in which we can crowd in different kinds of blended finance as we go out of the crisis to do better development and to do it differently? And I think, because we have Odile here, of course, there is a lot of work that's happening in many parts of the world in terms of, repurposing their stranded assets. In some sense, because the continent does not yet have all the energy that it needs. January 1, Africa just launched the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, the largest free trade area agreement in the world. But we need logistics, we need transports, we need roads to be able to make that work. And so there is quite an amount of investment that will create jobs, but which we can do differently, which we can do better, which we can do greener. And I think that is the purpose of a conversation like this, is to see how we can find and crowd in both external financing, but also looking at domestic and national pension funds. The French Development Bank, AFD, has also launched under Rémi Rio this big initiative called Finance en Commun, looking at how national development banks and regional development banks can contribute to financing. And I think we need to crowd in everybody behind the conversation on financing to see how we blend, to see how we ensure that we can bring down rates. A huge conversation that we're going to have as we get out of this crisis, or even get through this crisis, is the cost of resources for developing and emerging market countries. We're still going to the market at 500 basis points, 600 basis points, and we need to bring that down. And my sense is by doing more climate resilient, more sustainable investments, we can do that.
That's brilliant, that whole focus on crowding in, such a key element. Odile, if I might turn to you, EBRD has been a key partner of the Global Commission on Adaptation, so thank you for that. And working with the Global Centre on Adaptation to drive physical risk disclosure from financial institutions. How do you view the progress being made to integrate climate risks into the global financial system, and what more is needed?
I think that, first of all, we need to acknowledge that a lot of progress has been made, and that the perception from private investors about what is the climate risk, what does it mean, what are the long-term implications, what can be the impact for the sustainability and the solidity of the financial institution, as in the comprehension and the the understanding of this phenomena has increased dramatically thanks to the involvement of central bankers, notably through the NGFS, so the Network of Central Bank on Green Financing, and some people like McCartney who really drove the attention when he was president of the FSB and now under his current responsibility on these issues, increasing dramatically awareness. So I think that's a first big important step. With this dynamic, I think that we can see that financial institutions are all working on improving financial disclosure, showing the risk they bear on this activity, and mainstreaming this assessment and this disclosure of climate risk and take that into account in the financial decision, including financial risk related, for example, to hurricane, water, drought, and so forth. So this, I think, is movement we need to take into account. And an institution like the EBRD has been, of course, we are multilateral development bank, so this is much more closer to our mandate, but we have been one of the first MDBs and bank adhering to the TCFD conclusion in 2018 and committing to implement this conclusion, the recommendations in our own activity. And we are now working on this implementation, which is a lot of work. And in particular in our internal risk and procedures. What we are also doing is to share our knowledge and what we are learning by implementing this TCFD recommendation and so forth with our clients and the countries of operation to disseminate the best practices. So this is a good step forward, and really there is, I think, a positive dynamic there. This being said, there are a lot of things that remain to be done because the challenges are huge and the time is short. So I think that we need to continue to be very determined in our action. And I think I would see 4 priorities. The first one is not only to finance on to focus on disinvestment and the risk attached to some investment, but also to focus on the opportunities, because we want not only investment to withdraw from some risky activities, but also new money to be invested in financing adaptation and ensuring that investors have the tools and the capacity to finance resilience. The second big priority for me would be to support emerging markets and developing countries in benefiting from climate risk disclosure practices. And this means building the capacity of policymakers, the financial sector, and businesses to create a positive environment to crowd in finance for climate, start resilient investment, and avoid capital flight from the countries that need the most investments. There is a big risk when we focus on climate risk of capital outflows from risky countries. We need to do the contrary, to bring in capital so as to address the challenges. The third priority, in my view, would be to increase access to data and the quality of data on physical climate challenges, to have better access to weather forecasting. I understand for a number of countries, developing and emerging countries, very basic data like water data are really missing. And this is a big challenge because if you want to have appropriate policies, you need to know what you are talking about and what are the challenges you need to address. So this is very much an issue of investment in climate analytics and information services that are accessible to large and small businesses alike. So this is fundamental, public good in a way. And the last point would be to continue to strengthen the regulatory context so as to ensure that disclosure requirements are implemented and implemented consistently. And I think there is still a lot of work to be done on standardization of disclosure requirements, standardization of data, to ensure that information is more consistent, comparable, and meaningful for banks and investors alike. So I would say we are in the we are still a lot of things to be done. I think they are well identified. There is a dynamic, but we really need to go much faster and much stronger to deal with the challenges.
Thank you, Odile. And I can see some really strong common themes coming through, both from what you've been saying, but also with the earlier panelists, particularly around crowding in, but also the need for data and capacity building. John, I'd like to turn to you. You've been championing the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, which is a private sector-led initiative over 60 plus organizations with over 10 trillion assets under management that seeks to advance the integration of resilience considerations into investment decision-making since its launch at UNCAS in 2019. Where do you see this initiative really adding value? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the question, Emma, and it's great to be here with you and the other panelists. Before I get into answering, let me just give you an update on the coalition membership numbers. We're now at 70 institutions with more than $11 trillion of U.S. assets under advisement. So we've really been pleased at the rate at which the coalition's growing. In terms of your question about how we add value, what we're looking at CCRI and its deliverables is to advance some practical solutions for an efficient integration of physical climate risks in investment decision-making. And what we want to do is use those to illustrate what we call the opportunity side of client risks. So right now, a lot of the focus has been around disclosure and regulation. And just as that's a very important discussion to be having. But what happens is a lot of it has been trying to introduce some of the risks that people have in the downside. And what we know is that building more resilient investments actually has quite a big payoff. I think the video that we watched leading into this session talked about maybe a payoff of 10 for 1. What we're trying to do at CCRI is to develop agreed standards as to how those resilient investments have this opportunity side. And with the kind of discussion about risk-adjusted returns, about financial quality and opportunity, we can build resilience in at the beginning. So CCRI's solutions are devised to support governments, to support investors, and the private sector more broadly in their efforts to protect communities, economies, and also returns from physical climate risks. What we want to do is have our analytical principles and our analytical approach adopted by regulatory and credit rating initiatives in the climate space. Now, this is an ambitious agenda, but if we can get this, we can see a systematic integration of physical climate risk into investment decision-making. Our vision is really that within 5 years, we get to a point where nobody speaks about resilient investments anymore because all investments are resilient by default.
So, John, I'd like to pick up on that comment and perhaps get a reaction from both Odile and Vera. And that is to your point about the focus on resilience just being business as usual. We've got 3 different perspectives coming from each of you. How do we join the work that we're doing up to really bring about ambition and pace to what we're delivering? Vera, what are your thoughts?
I think 2 things. The first is to say that, we already are beginning to see the ambition showing up. for the continent for whom I represent and the Economic Commission for Africa, we've just been looking at some data recently. And unfortunately, over the last 10 years, for all the sort of new investments into renewable, into resilient infrastructure build, only 2% has come to the continent. So while we have stopped doing little pilots across the world, we're still doing a little bit of piloting on the continent. And I think it is time that we move from the piloting to just doing the full-scale resilient. And I'll take examples of, we know now that geothermal in Kenya works. We know that, hydro in Guinea works, and we know how to do it. We know that moving to rail infrastructure and better transport infrastructure works, and we know how to do it. And so my sense is, I think that what we need to do is the information, and Odile stressed that, is the information about what it is that we're doing, what are the benefits. And listen, we need to tell people about the job impact. I think if we can talk about the jobs and why moving, I think there is still a conversation that says, standardize, fossil fuel type investments may be the ones that create jobs. But we have just seen with the Nick Stern report and the work that is coming out of the London School that, on the contrary, resilient, climate sustainable investments actually pay higher return over the long term and create more jobs. And I think that conversation needs to come together. At the UN with the Secretary General, we've created this global coalition for investors in sustainable development, 13 trillion to join to John's trillions. There's trillions out there. And I think the question now is, how can we ensure that those investors tell the same story that the countries that are receiving the investment tell, so that we can actually together and jointly do the nature-based resilient type solutions. I take again another example, agriculture. We need to start doing large-scale resilient agriculture, but we're working in a community that needs more information, as Odile was saying. We're working in communities that need better weather stations to ensure that when you tell them, switch your planting or do planting differently, we need to give them information back. And so I think that combination of us, Economic Commission for Africa, that can do the research, do the advocacy, John and the rest, and Odile that are buying down the financing and blending the financing, is really what is needed to begin to get the kind of scale that you're talking about, Emma.
Thank you, Vera. And Odile, from your perspective, the EBRD launched the first ever dedicated climate resilience bond back in 2019. And I understand you're working to scale up the use of this instrument. How big is this opportunity, and how does it link to what Vera and John have just been talking about? Thank you.
Indeed, we launched in 2019 the first ever green resilience bond. And what strikes me is that what is very, important and I think very positive for the future is to see the very high demand on this kind of issuance. We were able to renew the lines, the credit lines, so to issue even more than what was foreseen. We started with 700 million. We ended up with 115 million up to now, and focusing really on financing adaptation measures on agriculture, water, and so forth. So it was really focused on resilience. And what is very positive is, I think, the strong appetite from the market to finance this kind of operation, which I think shows that there is this commitment and also this research of this kind of bonds. When you have a good methodology, transparency in the way the resources are used and so forth, it's very positive for the market. And I think that's something which is very encouraging. The other thing I wanted to make, start coming back to the first point made by Vera, which I think getting out of the COVID crisis, we know that we will have to have a lot of support to the recovery. And I think that what will be very important is to use this opportunity of the recovery to focus on the climate challenges. And this is true both for adaptation and for mitigation. To have a green recovery, there will be a lot of, public money in a way, because there will be a lot of support for the recovery to kickstart the economy again. But of course, also there is a lot of liquidity in the markets that needs to be invested. And therefore, I think that we should really take the opportunity of the post-crisis recovery and to build back better. I mean, everybody is saying that, but I think we really need to do it in concrete terms. And I think all the work done by the private sector to define common standards, to promote these common standards and so forth is absolutely key, because we know that otherwise, I mean, every institution is not going to reinvent the wheel, and we need some comparability across the board, understanding of what is really financed, what means what are the principles of, under the label and so forth. And I think that's absolutely key.
Brilliant. And we heard this morning from the UK Prime Minister, who will be hosting the G7 discussions later this summer and the COP26 discussions later this year, that green and resilient recovery will be a strong theme going forward. So, John, coming back to you, we heard today about Australia joining the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. How might governments and other international institutions step up and join some of this work? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Emma. Yes, and we were delighted to hear from Australia, and we've gotten some very good support from Jamaica to California, Canada, Antigua, Barbuda, and of course the UK, which is a key partner of CCRI. But we've had governments in both OECD and non-OECD regions eager to support and help work with us. And an important reason for this is that, as I said, we're talking about the opportunity site here. But if you think about a disaster like a hurricane devastating Puerto Rico, of course, governments are going to come in and try and help them after the fact. But one of the things we know is it's so much better if they supported resilient investment in the beginning and prevented a disaster on that kind of a scale. And I think that message is resonating with governments. The CCRI is, in fact, I think a great example of a public-private partnership. We need to be working together on that. One of the key initiatives that we have going on this year is that we're working with a couple of countries to think about how we take the standard tools we have and how we also make sure that as these things get priced, we price the opportunity in here. It doesn't mean that funds don't flow to the developing world. And so we need to make sure that we have mechanisms to do that. We're working with the government of Jamaica right now on a pilot project to see how we can do that. That's another one of our deliverables for COP26.
Brilliant. And again, that key focus on action. Vera, Odile, would either of you like to make a comment before on this, on what John's just said about getting governments as well as the private sector involved, this whole join up private public partnerships, before I ask you one final question about what we need to see action-wise this year? Odile.
No, I do completely agree with John that the action of the government is absolutely key. And this is why I was mentioning before the importance of data, the importance of sharing with the government our experience in terms of resilience. And because if government, for governments and for a country, it's also very important to have its own assessment of its resilience. And because, as I was saying, if there is not this assessment and this policy to address that, the risk of outflows is huge. I mean, we could have all this transparency, disclosure, and so forth could have a sort of perverse effect, which is, I mean, investors will leave the country immediately in order to avoid taking the risk of being losing money with an asset which is in a country or with a situation which is a country not sufficiently resilient. So I think this has to be taken by domestic policies also as a key priority and as a way to attract resources and not to create an incentive for this investment. So that's where the countries have to take ownership of this methodology to assess their own risk and to call on public investment and private investment so as to be able to address them.
Thank you, Adil. And I gave a very real and live example of what's taken place in the UK over the last week, where we have been subject to devastating flooding post-storm Christoph. But the investment that organisations such as the Environment Agency have put in place over the last 5 years have led to better protection, so that the amount of flooding of houses and businesses was very much reduced because of the investment put in place over recent years, and the investment that we've got planned for the next year or so. Vera, a final comment for you before I ask you one final quick fire question each.
No, thank you. We have the Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility that we're working on together with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and a host of other countries, funded by the Nordic Development Fund and managed by the Economic Commission for Africa. And I think inside of this facility is really exactly what we've been talking about, is building the capacity of these countries. But I think something quite important in this overall conversation on climate resilient investment is really to have countries from emerging markets at the table, because a lot of times, the sort of standardization and harmonization processes get done somewhere else. And then when you try to retrofit them onto the continent, be it Africa or Latin America, it turns out to be a little bit more difficult. And I think getting those countries at entry, getting Mozambique, I mean, we know and we've seen what has happened to Mozambique today. Mozambique is going to need to continue making investments, but managing and ensuring that its investments are invested in a more climate resilient. And they need to be at the table when we start setting the norms and start setting the standards, not that they're set somewhere else and then we spend 2 years building their capacity to understand the standards. And then by the time they do it, something else has happened because it wasn't nationalized or localized to their own environment. The second thing is, on the continent, we have done a lot, and a lot has happened in terms of crowding in private investment for public projects. And so there's a lot of PPPs and huge experience. And I think we must build from that. It's not sort of starting afresh where, those standards are not known. And so my sense is, to the private sector in particular, is come in, work with us, and together, the standards are meant to be adjusted to the changing environments. And I think as we adjust them and as we build them and as we move forward, we can do it much better and much faster. And so a lot of our governments are now sensitized to the need for the private sector. They are desperate for it because we don't have public financing. With issues like COVID happening to us, revenues have gone to a halt. So I think there is a much more willing and receptive approach to how we do the public-private financing, and we must do it together to get ahead of this faster. Thank you.
And thank you, Vera. I mean, it's key that we work very closely with Africa, not least as hosts of the following COP, the COP27. So really keen. I know I was talking with John the other day about how we make sure that Africa is very much part of the Coalition for Climate Resilience investment. So we have time for one question each, or I'd like you to respond to, in the same way that Andrew asked his previous panel, what do we need to see by the end of 2021? So perhaps if I could start off with John, then Vera, then Odile. John, over to you.
Okay, so I'll try to do this in one sentence the way Andrew asked. But by the end of 2021, we should have a broad consensus on standards for integrating physical climate risk into infrastructure.
Thank you, John. Vera, over to you.
By the end of 2021, we should have at least $1 trillion of John's trillions being invested in climate resilient infrastructure in Africa.
A very clear ask from you, Vera. And Odile, your response to that question?
I mean, I agree with what my colleagues in the panel said, and I would add the need to have much more issuance of bond resilience, so much more private money allocated to these kind of priorities, private and public money.
Brilliant. Well, we know that we have a huge agenda ahead of us. The whole theme of the Climate Adaptation Summit has been around action, very much a theme for the last year of the Global Commission on Adaptation. The commissioners have been very much focused on working with partners that can help us deliver action. I'd like to thank John, Odile and Vera for delving into some of these thorny issues that we do need to address if we're going to scale up ambition to finance adaptation and resilience. Thank you so much for joining me today on this panel. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you to all of the panelists for that insightful discussion. It's very clear that public-private collaboration is needed to mobilize funding flows for adaptation and resilience. The past year has revealed our collective vulnerabilities. Responding to the COVID-19 pandemic has already exhausted many countries' ability to invest in their growth and recovery. This poses significant challenges in responding to the climate crisis. So how can we make the progress that's needed? To address that question and more, I'll hand over to my colleague, Miranda Johnson, who is Deputy Executive Editor of The Economist. She will host our next conversation between the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, and Minister Sayed-Khaiyum of Fiji.
Thank you, Lauren. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of our audience to this panel. My speakers are eminent and need little introduction, but they are Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, who is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and she also co-leads the Global Commission on Adaptation. In addition, we have the Honorable Ayaz Sayed-Khaiyum, who is the Fijian Attorney General and also the Minister for the Economy and the Minister responsible for climate change, as well as the Commissioner to the Global Commission on Adaptation. My name is Miranda Johnson. I am the Deputy Executive Editor of The Economist. I've also served as its Environment Editor, and that means that I have particular pleasure today in discussing with Kristalina and Ayaz a climate resilient financial system in a post-COVID world. Perhaps Kristalina, we can turn to you for the first question. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic is everywhere and on everyone's minds. How has it led to a reappraisal of business as usual? And how can we use this moment and potentially the desire for change that it brings for good? How can we use it to further climate action?
Let me first say how grateful I am for the opportunity to be with Ayaz in this discussion. He has so much to share from an experience in a country on the front line of the climate crisis. We are experiencing a tremendous shock, the worst pandemic in 100 years, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It is a wake-up call. It tells us that we are in a more shock-prone world. And it is also an opportunity to recognize the critical need to build resilience to shocks in the future. And of course, for those who don't like the pandemic, there is no way you're going to like the climate crisis. When I look into the year we are having ahead of us, I see two consequential transformations that we ought to embrace. The first one is the transformation towards the digital economy and more automation. It is already happening. But hand in hand has to go the transformation to the new climate economy. And fortunately for us, we are in a world of low interest rates that provides ample opportunity
for governments, especially in countries with more fiscal space, to act decisively and underpin this transformation. When it comes down to climate resilience, it is for everyone to act. Anybody who thinks that the climate crisis is something that may come, wake up, it is already here. It is particularly pressing for the countries that are like Fiji on the front line. And let me just say, from our perspective, from the perspective of the fund, absolutely essential to embrace the right policies. Of course, above all, it is to slow down, arrest, reverse emissions, because the more aggressively we act on reducing carbon emissions, the less would be the need of adaptation. But then two, be much more forceful in adapting to a changing climate. We simply do not spend enough. There are various estimates. One tells us that we are maybe 5 to 10 times below what is necessary for climate resilience. And let me finish what climate resilience would entail. It would require resilient people, people that are healthy, educated, able to adapt with social protection at the time of shock. It of course requires resilient infrastructure. This is the costliest part of climate resilience. And it requires all sectors of our economy, agriculture, above all for food security, to adapt. So for everybody, we have to all come together. For the IMF, absolutely essential for macroeconomic stability and financial stability to step up, do our part of this job.
And Kristalina, what you were saying there about not spending enough, there obviously has been masses spent in the past year, shall we say, as countries and companies try to survive the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, there's going to be a lot of bad debt in the private sector. Do you think that will impinge upon what can be done now, and also make both public and private sector reticent to continue shelling out?
The first months of the pandemic, understandably, all the efforts were to prevent the economy from collapsing. So there are no massive mass bankruptcies, there are no massive unemployment anywhere. And what we have seen in the data is that indeed, the first 6 months, very little attention to anything but keep the economy afloat. This is starting to change. We are seeing much more forward-leaning approach by governments. The European Union is the brightest example, 750 billion stimulus package, 30% has to go green, with a lot of emphasis also on resilience. We see other countries very massively stepping up what the public sector is doing. And thankfully, we see incentives for the private sector. They're multiple. There is incentive coming from the banking community, more and more a recognition that we have to disclose climate-related financial risks. And as we standardize this disclosure, this would serve as a big impetus both for the transition risks and for the climate disaster risks. We also see more attention to carbon price. And let me say it as loud as I can. We ought to price carbon and over time bring it to the level that is necessary for this transition. And as governments generate more revenues from carbon taxation or carbon trade, they can direct these revenues, they can earmark it to compensate those that are impacted by this transition, but also to finance climate resilience, to finance the transition itself. Whether or not we act firmly and fast enough is to be seen in this year. Maybe the stars are aligning because we have COP26, a big driver of attention, policy and political attention. We have G7, G20, led by countries that are making loud and clear commitment to this transition. Virtually within hours of days of this discussion, we had US rejoining the Paris Agreement. So hopefully all of this would be, we wake up and we act in 21 to take the turn as decisively as possible. And on the issue of debt, obviously we have to think about how we bring down debt levels. That is for sure very important. But let me say, I worry about private sector because we are delaying some of the bankruptcies. I worry even more about low-income countries in high distress. And we have to have the policy support on both sides for the private sector with strong insolvency frameworks, well-thought process of making sure that if companies are to exit, it is not disorderly exit. For low-income countries in distress, more grants, more concessional finance, more debt relief, possibly linking some of it to climate action.
Absolutely fascinating. I'd love to come back to that point, but before then, I hope to bring in Ayaz, who can give us a little bit of sort of Fiji's perspective on what's been going on, because it's not as if COVID-19 is the only crisis that Fiji has faced in the past year. Ayaz, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about, what sort of Fiji has learned and can share about sort of regrouping and rebuilding, particularly in a resilient way.
Thank you. It's actually interesting because last year when we had some active cases in the community, I think we had about 5 or 6 cases, and there was various lockdowns in various parts of the country. We actually had a fairly large cyclone to the east of the country. So we had to actually deliver relief supplies, the logistics, rebuilding, whilst also having to be mindful of, the COVID-19 protocols. So I think it's the reality of the matter is you'll have both of them together. The other point is that, we had a Cyclone Winston, about 3-4 years ago that wiped off 1/3 of the value of our GDP within 36 hours. But we still had the tourism, most of the tourism properties actually were still up and running. So within 2-3 weeks, we had various parts of Fiji, receiving tourists. At the moment, none of the hotels are damaged. They're all fine, up and running, but there's no tourists. It has an enormous impact on government revenue, where a massive contraction of the economy, of the GDP by over 20%. And of course, now the new, dynamics is access to vaccines. And we have a country like Fiji, which is, has been COVID contained for close to 300 days now, no active cases whatsoever. So your ability to, given these sets of dynamics, your ability to actually build back better is very much restrained or constrained, I should say. We've just had a cyclone, Category 5 cyclone, in the northern part of the country. So, the way that you approach, for example, building back better, your ability to ensure that your infrastructure has a lot more resilience is far more limited. And we have to work within the constraints of the COVID-19 world in your country. So I think the reality of the matter is that working with your various international financial institutions, we've had obviously a demonstration by different organizations, showing an acceptance of these types of conditions existing in Fiji. We also have, the DSSI, for example, program, but of course, that's more targeted towards health rebuilding, taking care of the various socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19. But however, your ability to build back better again is limited. There is this year, our debt to GDP ratio is now shot up to about 85%. As Kristalina will tell you, that we have to be mindful of our debt situation, the sustainability of the debt levels. So just yesterday, I spent an entire day with the team looking at, putting in place various policies in place to have ensure a downward trajectory on our debt to GDP ratio, because we need to ensure the sustainability. That has an impact, of course, in your ability to respond to various climatic events. That has your ability to respond to building back better. So, things like accessibility to affordable finance becomes critically important. Whether you're talking to the World Bank, we're talking about IDA funds, that again becomes critically important also. So, there is no doubt that if you actually build back better, you can actually, of course, respond to climatic changes in a lot more, resilient manner. You'll have less damage. So you don't actually have to spend that much money on a yearly basis. We've had about 13 storms or superstorms in the past 8 years. You seem to sometimes think, well, I'm not getting out of it. But one of the positive sides of it, of course, is with this recent cyclone just a few weeks ago, the areas where we had actually built back better after Cyclone Winston, those, for example, schools, public buildings weren't damaged at all. There was some superficial damage, to, for example, water seepage, etc. But structurally, all those buildings were very much sound. So we don't actually have to fork out that much money.
And on a point that Kristalina brought up earlier about, the possibility of, theoretical at this point, but sort of linking debt relief or debt restructuring to climate efforts. Is that something that would make sense for Fiji?
Absolutely. We have all, been, I suppose, started the mantra of that development finance equals climate finance. In particular in countries like Fiji, where major focus is on adaptation. And we welcome any, debt restructuring or any type of financial instruments that would help provide a particular focus on being able to, finance building back better, and in a way that is cognizant that without this restructuring of a financial approach to building back better, most countries in the world that are at the cold face of climate change will be caught in a conundrum. They'll simply, if they don't build back better, they simply will be rebuilding year after year. And as we've seen, there's a prediction now that we will probably get another 2 storms in this cyclone season, which ends in April. We've already had one. So I think there has to be an understanding and probably an appreciation and in fact, accommodation by, various international agencies that there needs to be an effort in putting finance upfront for climate works, for building back better. And only then countries like us can actually progress. Otherwise, we'll be sort of stuck in a time warp, if you like.
One of the monumental challenges in obviously dealing with climate risks is that they're unprecedented, and they don't operate obviously like financial risks do. So I suppose this metaphor is somewhat inexact, but in financial crises of the past, 1929, after that we got standardized accounting. After 2008, we got measures to improve the reporting of risks and exposures in banks. Kristalina, I wonder, what do you think it will take? What magnitude of crisis, or indeed perhaps no crisis, will it take for us to get proper measurement and proper disclosure from the private sector around climate risks?
Well, I hope we don't have to live through a global catastrophe to take the actions that are necessary. And unfortunately, the wind is changing with regard to climate-related risks. We now have the coalition of central banks that are concentrated on disclosure. The IMF is an observer, and we are an active proponent of standardizing reporting of these risks and then moving towards from voluntary to mandatory disclosure. It is so important that we can see the assets we hold in a trajectory over time and be able to anticipate potential dramatic shifts in the value of these assets. And that I am confident that by the time of COP26, there would be a much higher degree of commonality and approach on how we deal with these risks. Beyond the financial sector, we have a very important objective of standardization as to what we consider green. There are shadows of green. There is quite some greenwashing in promoting green investment. So good news, a little bit less good news. Good news is the trend is up so clearly. Green bonds, green investment is going up. Not so good news. If we compare the green investment with the plain vanilla mainstream investment, it is still a mountain and a mouse. We have to create incentives for mainstreaming green investments. And I want to go back to the point I made. Carbon price is the very best way in which we can accelerate mitigation. Pricing disaster risk is the other element we have to work on. It can be done. And if I may, just to say something with regard to Ayas's comment on cost and the global obligations to countries like Fiji. When we did an analysis on the cost for resilience, building resilience in Asia, on average for Asia, 3% a year is what would be required. On average for the Pacific Islands, 10 to 15% of GDP a year. If I recall, for Fiji, it was 9%. This is a dramatic difference, and we have to find ways to do transfer financial support for countries where the needs are so profound and obviously they cannot carry this burden just on their own. Therefore, we have to look at grants and concessional financing on scale. I agree with Ayas very much. We have to rethink the concept of concessionality. Right now, it is only related to income per capita. Poor country gets grants, concessional finance, richer country doesn't. But if a middle income country is highly vulnerable to climate shocks, we have to find a way to factor this vulnerability in the way we provide support to these countries. So to finish, we have to create the right framework through standards for the financial system. No way we can sleep on this problem anymore, and it is moving. We have to provide incentives more broadly for private sector to move to green investments, and we have to help the countries that are at the front end of this climate crisis so they can be resilient and withstand it.
I wonder, and this is something that's debated in, economist meetings. Do we expect too much from green finance? I mean, for example, fund managers have, some influence over, indeed a big slice of the economy, but actually, many emissions occur outside of firms that they control, and they can't directly influence, you know, kind of state firms that are involved in energy and fossil fuels. Is there, are we offering, Kristalina, kind of green finance as you know, a kind of catch-all solution?
Well, my professional view on that is we have to make the market economy insensitized to be resilient and low carbon. And we know that markets react to incentives, and also we know that market failures require regulation. So that is a combination of two types of measures that would underpin this shift. On market incentives, carbon price is a very powerful incentive. We did a calculation at the fund of the size of indirect fossil fuel subsidies, not the direct that we see the difference between cost and price, the indirect, and it is mind-boggling. In 2017, $5.2 trillion of direct and indirect subsidies, of which 300 billion direct and the remaining indirect. And when you disaggregate, what is it? One, health cost. We pay for fossil fuels with our health. People die because of polluted air. And about a quarter is carbon not being priced. So you change, obviously this has to be done carefully, it has to be forward guidance over time. We cannot shock the economy to collapse, but that would change, of course, the direction of investments. And then sectoral policies, you know it, we have fees and we have rebates, create the incentive, and then the regulator has to be also there by making it so that society, the interest of society is the one that drives what we invest. And we would, sure enough, we see it in countries that are more aggressive going green, that the economy responds to these incentives and responds quite well. Now, the good part of the story is that when we do it, we boost growth and we boost jobs. It is amazing how many still hang on the myth that climate action is bad for the economy. How could it be bad? Because you have investments in green that happen to be in big chunk also job rich, like building insulation, reforestation, mangroves restoration, land restoration. So let's just say we are talking about a healthier economy and higher standards of living if we do what we are discussing here on scale.
Absolutely. Ayaz, I wondered if you sort of wanted to come in on kind of this point about, you know, what green finance can do for countries such as Fiji and sort of what it can't do, and understanding the realities of what's on offer.
Thanks. Look, I mean, I wanted to, when you talked about the, for example, green bonds, we've launched our green bonds with the assistance of, World Bank and various other institutions, in particular IFC, about a couple of years ago. Optics was great, as I said, but the interest rates weren't. It's listed on the London Stock Exchange. Interest rate is in excess of 6%. So, we are very much applauded for what it did, and we're actually very proud of it. We were able to launch it in a very short period of time. But the actual cost of that actually is something that is of concern. We are currently looking at some blue bonds because, as you know, we're an oceanic country. There are various aspects in respect of the blue economy itself that we can leverage off. And obviously it makes sense for us too, because, nearly 40% of our tourism, of our economy comes, or GDP comes from tourism sector. They come to Fiji because of pristine waters. We have to ensure that we preserve that. But there are, various impacts completely out of our control, acidification of the ocean, the dead corals, etc. So there needs to be investment in that space and a sort of sustained approach to it. There is, we believe, an opportunity working with our development partners without necessarily distorting the market and the pricing within the market or bonds, but having some influence for us. So we have had, currently we're talking to some of our bilateral partners, that if we did launch, for example, the blue bonds, if the market sort of says, gives you a 6% rate, whether our development partners actually can come in and subsidize about 4% of it, and we bear the cost of 2%. So you're not necessarily distorting the market, but at the same time giving us access to a financial instrument that hopefully in time, as we have, for example, various investments, superannuation funds, etc., they have a social corporate responsibility aspect to their investment. Some of them, for example, won't invest, in liquor companies or cigarette companies, for example. You can flip it around and say maybe a certain percentage of the investment portfolio should be in the climate change space, and assisting countries like us. So they expect not necessarily the full market rate, but a lower rate, but nonetheless they're ticking the social corporate responsibility box. I think that's critically important, and we do require the input from the IMFs of the world, the World Banks, the ADBs, etc. I think so. That's critically important. Secondly, I think the other point is we're just about to put in place our climate change bill to Parliament. We've had about 2 years of consultations, and it goes. One of the key aspects within this bill is what Kristalina talked about. Is about carbon trading. So we are having a national carbon trading platform. You have a country where 91% of all the land in Fiji is communally owned by various land-owning units, what we call tribal groups. And so we put in place a mechanism how they can actually get access and indeed see the benefit of keeping the trees in the ground and making money from it without necessarily having to cut it down. But also giving them access to finance, helping build communities. The last point I wanted to make in respect of financial instruments, the point I made earlier on, is not just simply a question of getting, concessional financing or grant financing, which is welcome as it is, but also building some long-term sustainability. Key aspect is insurance, getting access to insurance products. So when we had Cyclone Winston, we had to spend money to help people actually build their homes, at least give some part of funding towards rebuilding, because there's only about 10 to 12% of all the properties in Fiji actually insured. The very onerous requirements that have been put by private sector insurance companies in being able to get cyclone cover. We have been talking to various international agencies to how we can actually develop insurance products that may not give full indemnity cover for if your house gets blown away or there's a particular level of damage, but perhaps some form of relief where we have some basic cover. If you do basic strappings, then you can get a cover up to say $5,000 or $7,000. And then I think that's critically important to ensure that we get those products. We build sustainability. The other aspect, of course, that I want to talk about is this issue about increased disclosures, because increased disclosures actually, from one perspective, can be some people view it as a negative, because the reason why they view it as a negative, because you are actually stating your vulnerabilities up front. So if you are going to say, for example, a resort that's on the beach or somewhere close by to the beach and say, look, there'll be actually water in your room in about 10 years' time, it can reduce property prices. It can have an impact on the level of investment. But we have taken the bold step that we need to be able to be upfront with our level of vulnerability. What are the actual vulnerabilities? Because if we recognize them now, you'll be able to better react to it with a more sustainable approach to the realities of climate change.
I hate to interrupt you, Minister. I fear that a panel with the Managing Director of the IMF and Fiji's Attorney General, it was always going to be too short. But I do regretfully have to bring it to a close. But thank you both so much for your insights. I really wish we had longer, but at this point, I have to hand over actually to Andrew and Emma to reflect on what they've heard over the sessions and discuss a little bit more. But thank you both so much for your participation.
Well, what a truly inspiring discussion we just heard between Kristalina and Ayaz. It's always humbling to hear what has happened in Fiji, particularly with Cyclone Winston wiping 30% off GDP in 36 hours. And it's been a huge privilege working with Kristalina as one of the co-chairs of the Global Commission on Adaptation. So a huge thank you to Miranda, Kristalina and Ayaz for that discussion. We've heard that there is a monumental adaptation finance gap, with financial pressures being cruelly exacerbated by the COVID crisis. But we've seen a way forward too. Work from the Global Commission and its partners has shone a light on the opportunities presented by a climate resilient recovery to COVID-19. If we act rightly and act urgently, we can build forward for a brighter and more resilient future. We've seen the crucial importance of engaging the private sector to mobilise resources at scale. We've heard today about the opportunity presented by new and innovative financial instruments such as green and blue bonds, which can help us move away from over-reliance on public budgets. We've also heard about the more systemic challenge of transforming our financial systems and shifting the trillions towards more resilient growth pathways. Here again, we've seen the green shoots of private sector leadership, with investors worth trillions of dollars working to manage risks in their operations. This systemic shift will need multilateral coordination. We've seen the progress made by the IMF and multilateral development banks, and have seen the promise offered by country coordination through the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and the Network for Greening the Financial System, bringing climate risk and resilience into economic and financial planning across the globe. But it is clear there is still much to do. We need a truly transformational decade to overcome the challenges we face, and we all have a role to play. Governments, with support from multilateral organisations, must ensure that resilience is integrated into COVID responses to build forward better through both fiscal stimulus and policies. And developed countries must maintain their development assistance at this crucial time. Businesses and investors, by engaging in risk measurement and disclosure, can protect their bottom line while also supporting their communities. And all of us as citizens have the power to accelerate this action by making our demands known to our political representatives and those who manage our money, and by mobilising through civil society. 2021 will be a pivotal year as we emerge from the COVID crisis and look towards COP26. And I'm feeling greatly optimistic about what we can accomplish in partnership. So thank you to all our panelists, the audience, for joining us today. We've got a lot to do over the months and years ahead. Back to Lauren in the studio. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, and indeed to all of the speakers that have been part of our finance and investment session today. You've been watching the Climate Adaptation Summit, and wherever you are in the world, I'd like to thank you for being here with us too. With that, our session comes to a close. Goodbye.